Sarah had always found comfort in pet sitting. It was a quiet job, often more about companionship than work, and since she didn't have pets of her own, she loved every bit of it. So when a couple offered her a weekend gig to look after their pets in a quiet, tucked-away neighborhood, she didn't hesitate. The money was good, the pets sounded friendly, and with finals behind her, she was ready to spend a few days in peace. As she drove up to the house, however, she felt the first twinge of unease. The house was far from any neighbors, resting alone at the end of a winding, narrow road lined by dense trees. The structure was older Victorian with sloping gables and small attic windows that seemed to watch her as she parked. When she rang the bell, a woman named Mrs. Carson greeted her. Her eyes glancing nervously over her shoulder, she invited Sarah inside. Inside, the house was dim, and shadows clung to every corner despite the early evening light. Mrs. Carson's husband was a tall, stern-looking man who spoke little and seemed preoccupied. They introduced her to their pets, Max, a big black Labrador with gentle eyes but a rigid stance, Whiskers, a sleek tabby cat who quickly darted out of sight, and Percy, a parrot perched silently, staring at her with a level of intelligence that made her shiver. "Max needs a walk in the morning and evening," Mrs. Carson explained, "and Whiskers is a bit skittish, so don't force him to interact if he's hiding." Percy, she hesitated, glancing at the parrot. "Well, he's quiet at night." The instructions were straightforward enough until Mr. Carson's brow furrowed and he fixed her with a serious look. "Stay out of the basement. It's just storage, nothing you need to worry about." His tone was firm, almost sharp. "Understood," Sarah said, a little taken aback by his intensity. As the couple left, Sarah tried to shake the strange feeling in her gut. It was an old house, and they probably had their quirks. She told herself she'd focus on her job and ignore the odd feeling that seemed to cling to the house like a damp fog. That night, Sarah settled in, preparing herself a cup of tea and pulling a novel from her bag. She tried to get comfortable in the antique armchair in the living room, but every creak of the floorboards and groan of the house seemed amplified in the empty, silent space. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were open, watching the room with an almost unsettling intensity. Whiskers had curled up on the far end of the sofa, awake, his green eyes fixed on something in the corner. It was around midnight when she first heard it, a faint, scratching sound. It seemed to come from the wall behind her, a slow, deliberate scrape. She froze, straining her ears, but after a few seconds the noise stopped and the house fell back into silence. A draft rustled a nearby curtain, and Sarah jumped, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced at Max and Whiskers, but they didn't seem to have noticed. Old house, she reminded herself. Probably just the wind or settling wood. Trying to shake it off, she continued reading. But within minutes, the scratching resumed, this time louder and coming from a different wall. She put down her book, heart pounding, and rose to her feet, walking toward the sound. She peeked into the adjacent room, but it was empty. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving only the echo of her own breaths in the dark. As she stepped back into the living room, she noticed something odd. Max, who had been dozing moments before, was now wide awake, his body tense, ears pricked forward, his eyes locked on a dark corner of the room. Whiskers, too, had risen, his fur bristling as he stared with a sharp, unsettling intensity into an empty shadow. Both of them were transfixed, their gazes unwavering. "Hey, what's got you two all spooked?" Sarah whispered, but her voice felt small, almost swallowed by the heavy silence. Max let out a low growl, barely a rumble, but it sent a chill down her spine. She tried to follow their line of sight, but all she saw was a dark, empty corner. Yet it felt wrong, cold. She had the eerie sense that something was watching her, something unseen lingering just outside her field of vision. She backed away, her heart pounding harder as she tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. She forced herself to laugh, a hollow sound that seemed to vanish into the shadows. "You're scaring yourself," she muttered. But the pet's reactions didn't change. Max kept growling softly, and Whiskers remained motionless, his gaze sharp and unblinking. Just as Sarah was about to sit down, she heard it again, a scratch, but this time it was louder and closer, as if it were coming from inside the walls. She felt her throat tighten, her palms growing damp with sweat. The sound crawled along the walls, moving from one side of the room to the other, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. She forced herself to move, pacing around the room, peeking behind furniture, even opening a couple of cabinets, but there was nothing. Only shadows. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself she was letting her imagination get the best of her. But the pets, they kept staring, kept growling, as if they could see something she couldn't. An hour later, Sarah was still on edge, every small creak and distant scratch setting her nerves alight. She decided to head upstairs, hoping that lying down in her room would calm her. But as she reached the staircase, she felt a cold gust of air brush past her ankles, as if someone had opened a window somewhere in the house. She glanced down and found herself staring at the basement door. It was slightly ajar. A wave of dread washed over her as she realized she didn't remember it being open when the Carsons left. She moved toward it slowly, her hand outstretched, but stopped short. The pets had followed her to the stairs, Whiskers standing stiffly and Max growling softly, his eyes locked on the basement door. She pulled her hand back, her heart thudding against her ribs. She wasn't about to break the Carsons' rule, but as she turned to walk upstairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her from that narrow gap in the door, hidden just beyond her sight in the pitch-black darkness below. The next day seemed long and tense, even though the afternoon sun poured through the windows, casting warm light across the creaky, shadowed rooms. Sarah couldn't shake the unsettling experiences from the previous night, the scratching sounds that moved through the walls, the animals' tense, unblinking stares into empty spaces. She spent most of the day in the living room, half watching Max and Whiskers, hoping for a sign that last night's strangeness had been some kind of dream. But every now and then, one of them would turn suddenly, their gaze flicking to some unseen presence lurking in the corners of the room. By dusk, Sarah's curiosity about the basement had taken root in her mind. What's down there? She wondered. She told herself it was just curiosity, that the Carsons' insistence on avoiding it had put ideas into her head. But deep down, she sensed that the basement held the key to whatever was unsettling the animals and making the house feel so haunted. As night settled over the house, Sarah made up her mind. She waited until the pets were calm, Max stretched out in his bed, Whiskers hidden away somewhere, and Percy quiet in his cage. She tiptoed down the hallway toward the basement door, which was now closed but slightly off its latch, as if someone had left it that way on purpose. Her hand hovered on the doorknob. She felt her stomach twist in dread, but she pushed the feeling down and turned the knob, the door creaking as it swung open. A cold draft seeped out from the basement, brushing her ankles, and a heavy, earthy smell filled her nostrils. At the top of the staircase she hesitated, gripping the rail as she peered into the darkness below. As she took her first step down, the floor seemed to swallow up the sounds of her footsteps. Each step creaked under her weight, but the silence in the air around her felt almost oppressive. She continued down, and as she reached the bottom, she flicked on her phone's flashlight, illuminating a small, dusty cellar. Shadows pooled in every corner, and the faint light revealed strange, faded markings on the wall, symbols she didn't recognize, but that looked like they belonged to some kind of ritual. Small piles of animal bones were scattered across the floor, along with melted candles that had dripped their wax into strange patterns. In the center of the room was a worn wooden altar covered in dust and remnants of old candles. A few small, rusted knives lay atop it, their edges dull but stained with something dark, as though they had been used in rituals long forgotten. Sarah's heart pounded, her breath quickening as she took it all in. She didn't understand what she was looking at, but every instinct told her to turn and leave, to get out before she could learn more. But just as she started to back away, she heard it, a faint shuffling sound behind her, like footsteps brushing over the dirt floor. She froze, turning her head slowly toward the darkness at the far end of the cellar. She couldn't see anything, but shadows flickered just beyond the reach of her light. Panicking, she turned and rushed back up the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she reached the top, she nearly stumbled but managed to slam the door shut, her breath coming in gasps. But as she looked up, her heart stopped. Max was standing at the foot of the stairs, blocking her way, his head lowered, growling low and steady as if he were guarding her from something behind her. Whiskers slunk into the hallway, his gaze fixed on the basement door, his body tense, fur bristling. From the living room, Percy let out a guttural squawk and began repeating a strange name in a raspy voice, a name that sounded ancient, foreign, as if summoning or warning. The next day, Sarah could barely eat or focus. Every sound, every shadow seemed to jump out at her. She dreaded the approaching night but knew she had to stay. She'd already promised the Carsons. As the evening crept in, the noises returned, scratches, shuffles, even faint whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. Desperate for answers, Sarah started searching through the house, hoping to find something that could explain the strange occurrences. In the living room, tucked into a dusty shelf, she found a small, leather-bound diary. Flipping through its fragile pages, she realized it belonged to the house's original owner, a man named Edgar Crane, who had lived there decades ago. The diary was filled with obsessive entries about summoning spirits and listening to the voices. He described how he had learned to see and hear them by training the pets he kept, using them to help him make contact with whatever haunted the house. Her hands shook as she read, the words blurring on the page. She could barely understand the horrors he described, rituals involving his pets, calling them guardians of the gate, who could sense the spirits trapped in the shadows. The descriptions grew more frenzied as the diary went on, and his final entry warned that he had left something behind, something that would always linger. As she read, Percy squawked from across the room, repeating phrases from the diary with eerie precision. His voice echoed through the empty house, sending shivers down her spine. She realized with dawning horror that the animals weren't just reacting to shadows. They were seeing something, sensing a lingering presence, one that had been watching her since she entered the house. When the Carsons returned the next day, Sarah was waiting for them in the living room, the pets huddled around her, as if forming a protective circle. She could barely speak, her mind reeling from the sleepless nights, the unsettling discoveries. The Carsons exchanged a knowing look as she tried to explain what had happened. "It's all right, dear," Mrs. Carson said with a calm smile. "Not everyone can handle it." Sarah looked at them in disbelief, realizing that they'd known all along. "That's why we needed a sitter willing to stay at night," Mr. Carson added, almost apologetically. His eyes flicked to the basement door, and she could swear she saw a flicker of fear in them. They thanked her, paid her, and as she left, she caught sight of a new ad they'd posted, looking for a reliable pet sitter for overnight care. Story 2. Alice had always found pet sitting an ideal job. It was mostly quiet, paid decently, and suited her love for animals. Over the years, she'd worked in all kinds of homes and for all kinds of people, but none quite like Mrs. Whitmore, a wealthy older woman whose isolated mansion seemed to exude an air of mystery. The house itself, sitting far back from the road and hidden behind tall wrought iron gates, looked more like a relic than a home, with ivy creeping up its weathered stone walls and windows that seemed more for keeping the outside world out than letting any light in. It was hard for Alice to turn down the job offer, especially since the pay was unusually high, even considering the exotic animals she'd be looking after. Mrs. Whitmore had called it a unique arrangement. She had made a point of mentioning her pride in her unusual pets, a collection that included a massive Burmese python named Solomon, a pair of brightly colored macaws, a gentle but nocturnal kinkajou, and an ancient, lumbering tortoise. They were all housed in a specially built room near the back of the house, with each animal needing its own carefully monitored schedule. When Alice arrived, Mrs. Whitmore was warm yet reserved, her voice a soft, controlled murmur as she gave Alice a tour of the house. She walked her through the feeding instructions for each animal and stressed the importance of keeping to their routines. At the end of the tour, they reached the animal room, where a series of reinforced glass enclosures housed the pets. Mrs. Whitmore lingered at the final cage, a dark, shadowed space in the far corner of the room. "Just be cautious," she said, her voice tightening for the first time. "This one is very, very special. Not many people get to meet it, and for good reason. It has a sensitivity to strangers." She didn't elaborate further, but the warning seemed to linger in the air, an unspoken threat woven into her words. Alice nodded, her curiosity piqued but not enough to ask questions. She assumed it was some kind of rare or nervous animal. Perhaps Mrs. Whitmore was just being extra cautious due to the creature's exotic nature. As she said her goodbyes and handed over the keys, Mrs. Whitmore gave Alice one last long look, almost as though she were studying her. "I'll be back in a week," she said, her tone almost solemn. "Take care, Alice." Then she was gone, and Alice was alone in the echoing mansion, surrounded only by the strange pets she'd agreed to care for. The first day went smoothly enough. Alice familiarized herself with the animals, spending most of her time in the animal room and getting comfortable with their routines. Solomon the python was a massive creature nearly 12 feet long, but he stayed coiled in his enclosure, unmoving, his eyes dull and unbothered by her presence. The macaws, brightly colored and chattering, seemed to respond well to her, bobbing their heads and mimicking her voice with cheerful squawks. The kinkajou was shy, peeking out only at dusk, and the tortoise plodded around his cage in a slow, unhurried pace, paying her no mind. The last enclosure, however, sat shrouded in shadows, its occupant unseen. It was set back farther than the others, as though deliberately pushed into the dimmest corner of the room. Alice glanced at it occasionally, wondering about the mysterious creature within. She couldn't see much through the glass, and when she approached to get a better look, an odd, unsettling chill seemed to seep into her bones. The feeling was enough to keep her away for now. After all, Mrs. Whitmore had told her to be cautious. As night fell, the mansion took on a new aura. The long corridors darkened, and the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in from all sides. Alice double-checked the locks on the animal enclosures, then went to her room, which was located on the opposite side of the house. As she lay in bed, her thoughts drifted to the strange house, the animals, and especially to the last cage in the darkened animal room. When she returned in the morning, Alice felt a flutter of panic as she entered the animal room. One of the macaws was gone. She checked the cage door, expecting to find it ajar or damaged, but it was locked, just as she had left it the night before. Confused, she searched the room and even ventured outside, thinking the bird might have somehow escaped through an open window, but there were no signs of the macaw anywhere. It didn't make sense. The doors were locked, the windows secured. She told herself it was probably a fluke, a weird accident, and decided not to dwell on it. Still, an unease settled over her, a small prickling feeling at the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the thought that something was terribly wrong. By the third day, Alice was on edge. The second macaw had disappeared overnight, and her search proved just as fruitless as before. She scoured every inch of the room, checked the locks and windows again, and even combed through the mansion's shadowy halls. There was no sign of either bird. The tortoise had also vanished without a trace, which was even more baffling. Tortoises weren't exactly known for stealth or speed, and she couldn't fathom how it had simply disappeared. Alice felt a pang of dread as she tried to imagine what Mrs. Whitmore would think. The idea of the mysterious owner's return sent a nervous shiver down her spine, especially given the value of these exotic pets. The atmosphere in the house seemed to shift along with her rising anxiety. Shadows grew longer, and the corners of the mansion seemed darker, almost swallowing any light that dared to reach them. Every time she walked through the house, she felt a prickle on the back of her neck, as if someone or something was watching her. When she passed mirrors, she caught glimpses of strange reflections that vanished when she looked more closely, her own face seeming paler and more haunted each time she saw it. The animal room, once intriguing, had become a place of dread. The creatures she cared for seemed agitated, especially Solomon the python, who had started moving restlessly in his enclosure. The kinkajou, normally shy, now peered at her with a wide, unblinking stare, its eyes following her every move. She began to feel that she was no longer in control, that the house itself was aware of her and watching her every step. And then there was the final enclosure, the dark, shadowed cage in the back of the room. The sense of foreboding she felt around it had only intensified, as though whatever lurked within was somehow aware of her and waiting. Every time she passed by, she heard faint rustling sounds like something pacing in the shadows. That night, Alice resolved to stay up and watch over the room, determined to figure out what was happening to the pets. She settled herself on a chair in the corner, keeping her gaze fixed on the enclosures, though a prickling sense of fear gnawed at her. Time crept by, and her tired eyes grew heavier as the hours dragged on. Just as she was starting to drift off, a sound jerked her awake, a soft, slithering noise coming from the far side of the room. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Solomon was coiled tightly in his cage, unmoving, and the kinkajou was curled up asleep. But in the darkness of the last cage, a pair of sickly yellow eyes glowed faintly, watching her. Alice's breath caught in her throat. She could see the faintest outline of the creature now, a strange, hunched shape that seemed to shift and blend into the shadows, its eyes unblinking and unnervingly intelligent. It felt as though those eyes were boring into her, reading her thoughts and understanding her fear. She tore her gaze away, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the chair. Whatever was in that cage was not like any animal she had ever encountered. By the fifth night, Alice was desperate for answers. She'd hardly slept in days, haunted by the vanishing animals and the unsettling presence lurking in the animal room. Shadows seemed to creep along the walls, and she often heard faint whispers echoing through the empty halls, like soft, mocking laughter. As darkness fell, she forced herself to return to the animal room, determined to confront whatever was happening. This time she was ready to go further. She had to. There was only one pet left, the creature hidden in the last enclosure, and she knew that it held the answers to the disappearing animals, the growing darkness, and her own creeping terror. When she reached the animal room, she found the creature awake, its yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light. Heart pounding, Alice approached the cage, ignoring the prickling sensation of fear that crept over her. She could see it more clearly now, a shadowy, fur-covered being with limbs that seemed too long, its posture both animalistic and disturbingly human. It was crouched low, watching her with an intelligence that made her shiver. She reached for the latch on the cage, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread. But just as her fingers brushed against it, a sudden, chilling growl echoed the room, low and menacing. She froze, her gaze meeting those glowing eyes as they narrowed, the creature seeming to grin at her in the dark. In a sudden burst of panic, Alice stepped back, her hands shaking. She knew she should leave, that she was in over her head, but she felt trapped, rooted to the spot by a force she couldn't explain. The creature watched her, its gaze intense and unyielding, as if daring her to open the cage. Then, in the silence, she heard it, a soft, whispering voice, as though someone were speaking right into her ear. "Let me out, let me out." The voice seemed to come from the darkness itself, wrapping around her like a chilling fog. She stumbled back, her heart pounding as the shadows in the room seemed to shift, taking on strange, unsettling shapes. Her eyes darted to the door, and she realized with a sickening dread that it had closed on its own. She felt trapped, the oppressive darkness closing in around her as the creature's eyes gleamed with a knowing light. It leaned forward, its claws clicking softly against the glass, the whispering voice growing louder, filling her mind with images she didn't understand: a desolate landscape, ancient stones, rituals under a blood-red moon. Just as she was about to scream, the lights flickered on, and the door creaked open. Alice spun around to see Mrs. Whitmore standing there, watching her with a serene smile. "Did you meet my last pet?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her voice calm and measured, as though she had expected this all along. Alice stared at her, wide-eyed and trembling. She tried to form words to explain the terror she had experienced, but no sound came out. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, her gaze shifting to the shadowed cage. It's been here for a very long time. Longer than this house, longer than the land itself. It feeds off of fear, you see. It needed a little snack while I was away. Alice felt her knees go weak, the horror of realization washing over her. Mrs. Whitmore had known all along. She had left her here, alone and defenseless, as food for the creature in the cage. Unable to take it any longer, Alice fled from the room, racing down the long, dark corridors and out of the mansion. She didn't stop running until she was far from the house, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she looked back, she could see the faint glow of yellow eyes watching her from the upstairs window, a reminder of the darkness she had narrowly escaped. And as the night closed in, she heard Mrs. Whitmore's voice echoing in her mind, soft and chilling. "Thank you for feeding it, Alice. It won't forget you." Alice couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Whitmore had known exactly what would happen, that every vanished pet and eerie night had been orchestrated to lead her into that room with the last creature. As she ran down the driveway, the eerie silence of the night wrapped around her, broken only by the echo of her own frantic footsteps. But even the fresh night air couldn't clear the lingering dread from her mind, nor the image of those glowing yellow eyes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. In her panic, she almost didn't notice it. When she finally fumbled it out, she was surprised to see a new text message from Mrs. Whitmore. "I wouldn't stray too far. The creature has a tendency to follow." The message chilled her to the core. She looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes in the shadows behind her. Was it already on her trail? Or worse, was there no escaping it now that she'd entered its cage? She took off running again, adrenaline fueling her. But the echo of Mrs. Whitmore's words stayed in her mind. Her feet pounded the pavement, moving her farther from the mansion, yet no matter how fast she went, the sense of a dark presence loomed at the edge of her vision, trailing her like a shadow. Desperate, she remembered a nearby convenience store that had stayed open late. If she could just reach it, maybe she could find someone to help, someone who could tell her this was all a nightmare. But when she reached the door and darted inside, the store was empty. The overhead lights buzzed in dim, sterile hues, casting harsh shadows over the aisles of cold, lifeless goods. Alice's panicked footsteps echoed through the silence, her heart thudding loudly in her ears as she darted toward the counter, hoping to find a cashier. There was no one there. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper began just at the edge of her hearing. It sounded eerily familiar, echoing Mrs. Whitmore's words from before, twisted and distorted. "Thank you for feeding it, Alice." She clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, willing the voice to go away. But it only grew louder, its tone darker and more menacing. The shadow she'd seen back in the mansion seemed to flicker at the edges of her vision, as if creeping closer with each heartbeat. Just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, her phone buzzed again. Trembling, she looked down at the screen, expecting another taunt from Mrs. Whitmore. But it was a message from a number she didn't recognize. "Do not look back. Do not speak to it. Return to the mansion by sunrise, or it will follow you forever." Alice's mind reeled. Who was this? Could she trust them? But the urgency in the message left her no choice. Her only option was to return to the mansion. She felt trapped, yet something about the command resonated within her, as though she was being given the only way to survive. With heavy dread, Alice forced herself to retrace her steps. Her feet moved slowly, almost against her will, as she approached the dark silhouette of the mansion looming in the distance. The twisted branches of nearby trees clawed at the sky, casting eerie shadows across the driveway. As she neared the mansion, the front door creaked open on its own, as if inviting her back inside. She stepped across the threshold, feeling as though she were walking into the maw of some enormous beast. The animal room was just as she had left it. The cages were still empty, except for the last one. The creature's sickly yellow eyes gleamed from within, watching her with an unsettling intensity. It was almost as if it had been waiting for her, expecting her return. But this time something was different. The shadows seemed to pulse, shifting and expanding as the creature's form began to morph. Its limbs elongated, bending in unnatural ways, and it crawled toward her, pressing against the bars of its cage as if testing them. Alice backed away, her heart pounding. She had to hold her ground, to resist the urge to flee. She remembered the mysterious message's warning, "Do not look back. Do not speak to it." Instead, she forced herself to look directly into those glowing eyes, her breath shallow as she fought against the fear rising in her chest. The creature tilted its head, its gaze sharp and calculating, almost human in its expression. Then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural murmur. "Do you know why you were chosen?" Alice's blood ran cold. She hadn't spoken a word, yet it had answered a question she hadn't dared to ask. "I am bound to this place," it continued, its voice dripping with a sinister satisfaction. "And now, so are you." The words felt like chains wrapping around her, dragging her deeper into the house's darkness. She took a shaky breath, clutching the edge of the nearest table for support. In that moment, she understood the twisted bond between Mrs. Whitmore and the creature, a bond that now extended to her. The creature let out a rasping laugh, a sound that echoed through the empty room and sent chills down her spine. And just as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. The creature's eyes dimmed, and it slunk back into the shadows of its cage, as if retreating into some hidden realm. The first light of dawn began to break through the windows, casting faint rays into the house. The oppressive darkness that had filled the mansion began to lift, replaced by an eerie calm. And then, as if nothing had happened, Miss Whitmore stepped through the front door, her expression one of pleasant surprise as she saw Alice waiting for her. "Ah, Alice," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I see you met the last pet." Alice stared at her, numb with exhaustion and terror. She tried to find words, to demand an explanation, but her voice failed her. Mrs. Whitmore's gaze drifted to the creature's cage, a look of pride glimmering in her eyes. "It's been in our family for generations," she said softly. "An heirloom of sorts. It requires a little sustenance from time to time." Alice felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the realization set in. She had been nothing more than a pawn in some twisted ritual, a way to appease the creature and ensure it remained bound to the mansion. "It chose you, Mrs. Whitmore continued, her tone almost affectionate. "Most people don't last the first night." She turned to Alice, her smile widening. "You were brave to return. That is rare and admirable." With a sense of finality, Mrs. Whitmore reached into her bag and handed Alice an envelope. "Consider this a token of our gratitude," she said, her voice smooth and disarmingly calm. Alice didn't even look at the envelope. She only wanted to leave and never return. She staggered out of the house, the fresh morning air feeling like a lifeline as she put as much distance between herself and that cursed place as possible. Months passed, and Alice tried to bury the memories of the mansion, but she could never shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the creature's eyes followed her in every shadow, and sometimes, late at night, she would hear the soft, mocking whisper in her ear, as though the creature's voice had followed her beyond the mansion's walls. One night, while brushing her hair, she noticed something new, a faint, shadowy mark on the back of her neck, a symbol she couldn't recognize but felt she somehow knew. The creature had marked her, binding her to it, just as Mrs. Whitmore had hinted, and no matter where she went, she could feel its presence lurking in the dark, waiting patiently for the day when she would return to the mansion.